Are you seeing a PowerPoint thing, hopefully?
Yep.
And there we go. Okay, thank you. I chose quite a broad title for our talk this morning, energy transitions, as you all know. But I was saying just a while ago that my work has moved from the technical into societal barriers. And I've been looking at barriers to an energy transition and then, of course, potential solutions. There's a nice picture of a smokestack industry of some kind. And the challenge, the team I work in at Erasmus is called the Global Societal Challenge Team. And I look after energy and climate change. And as we all know very well, the United Nations is seeking to limit our climatic temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. It is currently about 1.2 degrees. So this is a rather urgent matter to be dealt with. We can look at things through the lens of technology. Our electricity demand in the UK is about 1/2 heating, 1/4 transport, and 1/4 electricity. But there is increasing electrification on the technical side. Transport is becoming increasingly electrified, and indeed so is heating with the introduction of heat pumps. And it is highly likely that future government action will be to reinforce both of those processes. So we will see much more electrification in future. And of course, that electrification depends greatly on the technology of energy storage and batteries. And again, we will see that that's received a great boost through electric vehicles, but also for heating of houses, for linking storage to heat pumps as well. But I'm wanting to concentrate today on societal issues. Firstly, looking at barriers, such as, for example, as we found in South Africa, incumbent resistance, the resistance of the fossil fuel industry to change, and then possible mechanisms to resolve these barriers. So, as Ted mentioned, we were both in South Africa in 2018, doing interviews for our PhD. I was concentrating on solar energy, and it is a question that has always attracted me when with African nations having so much resource on solar energy. There are some moves to use that energy resource, but it could be so much more. And indeed, Africa could export energy to Europe, for example, and there's been a little bit of that done in Morocco, but nowhere near the resources that are available. And my work there, I was looking at types of barriers, types of societal barriers, and there had been some published work on this previously, about 20 years ago, and I introduced my own taxonomy of 8 groupings of barriers, policy barriers, and they're not unique. Of course, there are slight overlaps between them, but I'm not going to read them out. You can see the sorts of areas that we were talking about. And then, of course, just a very simple octagonal presentation of these 8 areas of potential resistance to energy transition. We conducted interviews there with semi-structured elite interviews with about 30 energy experts in South Africa, drawing from government and trade unions and industry and NGOs, and adopting a very simple quantitative approach of asking the simple question, what do you think is the barrier to energy transition? We came up with this result. And the first thing of interest, I think, is that nobody thought technology was a problem, a barrier. The technology exists, the technology is available, it is And even finance wasn't even considered much of a problem either. Finance was available. The principal barrier, which I've marked here as institutional, but it was related to the state electrical utility, which is called ESCOM, E-S-K-O-M. And when you realize that South Africa gets 90% of its electricity from coal, you can see why there's possibly a very large amount of friction to change coming from some of these institutions. Of course, these barrier sources do not act in isolation either. They can act in combination. So we find in the literature on South Africa something called the energy minerals complex. And so you have the mining industry acting in concert with the mining trade unions, who are very politically powerful, and some of the institutions such as ESCOM to act to prevent the uptake of renewable energy. So as I was saying, the principal weakness was the state electrical utility, ESCOM. The government is in a very difficult position, seeking to balance the desire to move on climate change, but with these vested interests. When the South African government proposed to break up ESCOM into its constituent parts, production and transmission, etc., exactly as the UK did 40 years ago, and they proposed a very similar model. There was a huge backlash. ESCOM, I wouldn't say engineered, but there was a lot of rolling blackouts happened. And also the mining unions threatened a national strike, and the government had to back down. The government had to recognize the political power of these pressures. And ESCOM has not been restructured as they publicly announced they were going to do, and it didn't happen. And as I say, we've got the political power of the mining industry and also the strength of the mining unions. And I have one other little graphic there, and I use this to show that these individual barriers can act in concert. And of course, when they're acting in concert, they are much more difficult to overcome than just one of them individually. So we move forward 2 years now to 2020, last year. And we were provided with funds from the NWO, which is the Dutch Research Council. This was work carried out at Erasmus University Rotterdam. And the task was to look at the impact of COVID-19 on the energy transition in the Netherlands and the UK. So we did this in the summer, over the summer months last year. And we conducted 60 interviews with 30 organizations. So we interviewed each one twice at the beginning of the summer and the end of the summer, because it was a very rapidly changing scene and we wanted to see how people's views were changing. And then half of the interviews were held in the Netherlands and half in the UK. And so the 15 organizations in each country, and those 15 were divided equally, 5 each, between government interests, industry interests, and the third sector. So it was all done by Zoom, of course, quite intense phase of interviewing going on last year. And our objectives, you'll not be surprised from what I've already said, is we started with what barriers are acting in these countries to impede the energy transition. How should society respond to those barriers? And then in the second interviews, we had generated some draft recommendations from the first set of interviews. And so we gave them these draft recommendations. I said, there were 10 of them, would you please put these draft recommendations in priority order, which we thought was quite an interesting thing to do. And finally, while that question asked, what should we do? The final question was, how should we do it? And which mode of governance is the most appropriate for implementation? and I'd like to take you through the findings. Our reports have been published in a report and distributed to all interviewees already. But if we begin firstly with the barriers, and I'm using here, you'll recognize the same graphic as I used in South Africa, and you can see here that the balance between the barrier types is much more balanced. There were some technological issues raised, perhaps surprisingly, but there was some of the Dutch interviews in particular were very anti-wind energy, and this came through some of the Dutch interviews. Also, you can see that financial is a much greater barrier here than in the previous case. And this was because people were worried that the demands of COVID would take financing away from climate change and green issues. And that was, at that time, viewed very much as a threat. And you can see among the other types of barriers, a rough balance, a bit of an emphasis there on the role of central government. And again, it was this fear of governments being distracted by COVID and taking their eye off the climate change priority. Our recommendations, the 10, and these are in priority order. I'm not going to read these out, but the top recommendation was to do with green investment. Obviously, I think you might expect that to be the case. Interestingly, the second most popular recommendation was using the tax regime to place a higher priority on social justice, especially considering vulnerable groups. And many of the interviewees raised concerns about vulnerable groups in society during the interviews. And I'll let you just look at the other two briefly. You'll not be surprised perhaps by any of them. That was followed by a further 4. Some of these, I'm not going to read this out, I'll let you look at them. Interesting, the links between hydrogen and offshore wind was recognized in both countries, and indeed both countries have serious plans for coupling hydrogen and offshore wind in major offshore projects. And finally, the last 2. And you might be surprised that the home working point came 10th out of 10 recommendations, but as some of our interviewers said, well, this is already happening. This has already happened, so I'm not going to give it a priority for future action. And then we came to the prioritization, and we came up with a visual way of representing this. So you've got your 10 recommendations on the left, and I haven't repeated them for ease of too much on the slide. But we adopted a kind of traffic light system. So the top 4 most popular recommendations were green, and then 3 were amber, and then 3 were red, as you can see from the overall list. But then, of course, we were able to divide the responses between those that came from Netherlands and those that came from the UK. There's columns there. And then, of course, we were also able to generate the responses from the government interviewees, the industry interviewees, and the third sector interviewees. Now, you get some interesting things coming through when you look at this in a little more detail. Because if you look at the UK responses and the industry responses, these were actually in quite close alignment, and you might wonder why that was, too, that the UK views were very much aligned with commerciality and an awareness of the economic importance of doing this. I'm trying not to dip into national stereotypes or anything like that. It is interesting. And then you can look at Netherlands and the third sector. And they're not identical, but they're not far off being identical. And here we find that the Dutch interviewees, it seemed from the interviews, were much more socially aware and aware of the kind of society networking type approach to issues. And finally, in this section, and this was really interesting to me as a former civil servant, we found that the government views, the views of the governments in both countries, matched the average median views of the total population. And so what you're seeing in this slide is government are adopting a median position between the views of industry and the views of third sector. And that's exactly what you would expect government to do, or at least hope that government would do. And therefore, I'm very interested by what this slide happens to show. We then move from the question of what do you think should be done to how should it be done, or who should do it. They were not necessarily exactly the same. And if you're into modes of governance, you will know that there are three classic modes of governance: a hierarchical approach, top down from government, a market-led approach, and a more collegiate networking type of approach. And of course, you don't necessarily have to be on one of the points of the triangle. You can be partly way along to any of the axes, really. People often talk about a hybrid between hierarchy and market, for example, or you could be somewhere in the middle with elements of all three. So we developed a way of taking our recommendations and assigning them a mode of government. So, for example, the recommendation on adapting the tax regime would be very much a governmental mode of intervention. And we were able to do this and then take our results and plot the views of the different groupings on this triangle. So we plotted firstly the Netherlands results and the UK results, and they're quite similar. They are really quite similar. I mean, you would expect that. I mean, the two countries are really quite similar economically, politically, socially. Perhaps a slight preference for a hierarchical approach coming from the Netherlands, which is interesting, but the differences are not great. If we do the same with government, industry, and third sector, here there is a definite preference among government interviewees to adopt a hierarchical or top-down approach. None of the groupings were heavily towards the networking end, which is an interesting thing because a lot of the published literature nowadays is talking about the importance of networking, solutions and consultation, etc. But our findings were not towards that bottom left-hand end of that graph. So what did we conclude in our report? We concluded there's broad agreement on what needs to be done. The priorities certainly picked out green investment, tax reform, and there was quite a thread of community involvement coming through our various recommendations. There were some differences between the countries. They were minor, but could be quite interesting all the same. And as I said, we have submitted our report to both governments and to all interviewees. On the downside, we found, and it may still exist today, there was a risk that other financial pressures such as health, unemployment, education might eclipse the environment. And the jury is out on whether individual behaviours will change in the long term. And this is talking about air travel, holiday travel, use of public transport, buses, trains, etc. But on the plus side, all eyes are now on the COP26 meeting, which we were discussing a moment ago in Scotland in November. Certainly for that, the active US involvement is most welcome. The change of administration there, it's chalk and cheese, isn't it? And the EU, who had their Green Deal proposals, which became incorporated into the COVID Recovery Fund, but it has stipulated that 37% of that COVID Recovery Fund must be used for purposes of climate change and energy transition. But as we all know, the need for action is very urgent indeed. So I'm going to pause there to pick up any questions.
Thanks, Ian. I've a question about the behaviour point you made in your second lot of conclusions. I mean, how much did your interviewees feel that how did they see the role of government in actually shaping behaviour through infrastructure? Because people's individual behaviour sometimes seems like a bit of a get out, you know, it's, oh, there are all these individuals and they're all making their choices, but they have to make their choices from what's available to them. And I wondered what you found about how people perceive the role of government and industry in shaping those behaviours.
Yeah, I think a couple of points on that. I think firstly, there was a widespread recognition that to deal with climate change required all of the levers to be pulled. And so, you know, governments had to act, industry had to act, communities had to act, and also individuals had to do their bit as well. And so when you come to governments, I mean, governments are very powerful things. They can make laws and they can raise taxes. But quite a cheap way of governments to act is through communication. And we discussed with government representatives in both countries the role of communication campaigns in persuading people to do things. And of course, we have some excellent examples in this country and other countries, like recycling, for example, where simple campaigns have really changed individual behaviours. And so I think there was a willingness on the part of government and a probably recognition on the part of individuals that this was going to happen, that government was going to encourage people to be greener in their behaviour.
But if you look at the most, you know, what's arguably the most intractable difficulty, which is transport related emissions, say, if you've got a government that carries on not investing in railways, building more roads, you know, and then kind of waving its hands and saying, oh, well, everyone's going to have electric vehicles. I mean, I get
it is the most intractable. You're exactly right. And the government must do more to encourage walking and cycling and, you know, the hierarchy of transportation systems. Yes.
Yes, I get a bit twitchy at times when I hear governments talking about behaviour and these nudge type. You think government should not try and influence behaviour, perhaps? Oh, governments inevitably influence behaviour. I don't think they recognise it enough, and I think they're putting too much weight on the individual, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think I don't think the government should do that, because, as I was saying, governments have to do their bit as well, and they have to dig deep. And some people said, you know, as a result of COVID, whereas governments might traditionally say, oh, we can't afford something. I mean, what COVID has proved is that government finances are remarkably elastic when they need to be.
Yeah.
And they're proved that in a truly crisis situation, governments can find finance and bring about change.
Yes, that's been staggering, really, what we've learned over the last 15 months in that respect, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And also, actually, how much direction people will take, because the early government idea seemed to be, you know, the British people will never stand for lockdown and being told they can't go to the pub. In fact, we were all very obedient until about May of last year, when it started to break down a bit. If we perceive that there is a real crisis. I was very interested what you said about hierarchy and networks and so on too, and where the priorities were. And I suppose one of the great strengths of hierarchy is that you have clearer accountability than you have with networks.
Yeah, it's interesting in COVID because, of course, some countries which are a bit more authoritarian impose much more strict lockdown. South Korea, for example, or Taiwan, and there was a lot of debate about individual freedoms, whether freedoms were being compromised by the use of mobile phone tracing, for example. And it's a very interesting debating point as to where that balance should lie between societal needs and individual freedoms. Ted, you've got your question here.
Yes, this may be slightly unfair because I participated in the South Africa interviews, some of the South African interviews. But there's something that I find quite staggering. Lawyers and politicians, all of them, without fail, said technology and finance were absolutely fundamental in the energy transition. Everybody else who was on the ground did not think that was a problem. And this is for you and everybody else on the, on the call. Is there a disconnect between legislators or lawyers and politicians and the rest of society in the energy transition? Because this was repeated. The only place where there was a bit of a variance was in the US, where they thought technology wasn't really a big deal, but finance mattered. So over to you, Ian, and anyone else who can chime in. Is there a disconnect between the people who set the laws and policy and the people who are actually working on the ground?
I'll just say at the beginning there, I was surprised in South Africa that so many of the people did not consider finance an issue. I had expected to find it to be a major hurdle and aid was insufficient or whatever, borrowing powers of the South African government were insufficient, and not many people said that. So that was a real surprise to me from that piece of work. But I'll throw it open to others to comment.
In talking about technology, did they just talk about innovation or like particular technologies that would be needed, or how to implement them or how to use them? Or just, I think what I'm asking is, did they understand, did it feel like they understood that there's people using the technologies?
Yeah, I think the options that arose in South Africa were between wind and solar, and there had been reports produced that said that South Africa was blessed with both in huge measure. So it wasn't as if they were pushing the technological boundaries, like introducing hydrogen as a vector, for example. It was the use of established technology that had been proven all over the world, and with the massive cost reductions in both that have been noted and developed in the last 10, 15 years. So they could be ready to benefit from these huge cost savings of these technologies. But it was the resistance, the reluctance to change on the part of the coal industry and the electricity industry.
Yes.
I think it will come, but it will take a long time to come because they are so resistant to change.
Yeah, I would have an opinion on that based on what you've explained and Todd's framing of the question. So are governments too far away or kind of detached from what's happening on the ground with society? And it would sound like this. There's many things happening on the ground and many kind of opinions being formed on the ground. So maybe they are very well connected to some opinions that tend to replicate the idea that the so I know very well the example of Mexico, but also based on what I studied on China as well. The idea that some very engineers and some very technical groups would still have opinions that say that solar and wind energy are very problematic for the grid. And some officials would hear them and they would feel comfortable saying that they are hearing technical opinions. And based on the credentials, they would be right on saying that they are hearing technical opinions when someone tells them that solar and wind are problematic for the grid and therefore there's a technological problem there. The thing is that these technical opinions are not detached from specific preferences and programs. So I think that's always that to consider at least.
Yeah. There are some sensitive issues on this technology issue, because if you think about solar energy in Africa, first of all, there are huge numbers of population who do not have access to any electricity grid at all. And there have been programs to give people solar panels in a village, and they can then have lighting in their homes for the evening so their children can do homework, etc. And that is a marvelous change. But then, of course, you raise expectations and they want to use the electricity to cook. And if the whole village wants to cook at the same time, which of course they do, solar energy cannot do that. So you raise expectations to kind of Western standard. Solar energy cannot do that. You need, and I read about one project in Namibia, which was adopting a more hybrid approach, and they use solar energy during the day, but when it came to meal times, when the load demand shot up, they had a diesel generator, and this diesel generator only operated for an hour at lunchtime and an hour at dinner time. And I kind of became reconciled that while it was, I would like everyone to go down 100% green energy, and maybe a little bit of compromise along the way can help things along faster.
I think also just to add to that, and then I'll ask a question. Namibia is a strange also place, and strange in a nice way in terms of you're talking about societal pressures. Namibia is probably 4 times the size of the UK, with a maximum of 2-point-something million people. And so the population dispersion is incredible. And so the idea that the government would send out a grid to everybody is quite difficult. And at the same time, they do recognize that they hold some of the world's largest uranium deposits. And so one of the challenges that I had when talking to their government officials was intergenerational equity, but with a very strange twist. They were saying, what will we tell, what will our progeny think of us when 30, 40, 50 years, they'll see we've vacuumed all of the uranium out of it, and we do not have even a single nuclear power plant. And there was a bit of pushback on baseload, because they were saying, yes, we have solar, but I remember one person vividly telling me, I cannot iron my shirt with. And so there are, to what extent did societal or cultural issues come into play? And do you think that this explains the difference between governance in the UK and Netherlands and in South Africa and Namibia, for example? Because some of your findings are starkly different.
Yeah. The PhD work in South Africa, as you well know, concentrated on elite interviews. We interviewed energy experts from all of the different groupings that you would imagine. But what we did not do was a survey of ordinary people in cities and ordinary people in rural environments. And possibly that would produce a very different perspective on the matter. I'm sure it would have done. I did visit a township when I was in Cape Town, but I didn't interview there. And I think that would be a very interesting next step to compare and contrast, as you were saying there, the views of people high in corporate business and people on the ground.
Ian, you were head of renewables for the UK government for some time, I think. And I wonder, when you look back on the work you've done since, how does it, first of all, it make you feel there were ways you might have done things differently when you were head of renewables, if you'd known then what you know now? Then looking at the current situation, how do you feel about the way the current things are going in at the moment in terms of getting renewables established in this country?
Yeah. The period I was in that post in London was roughly 2000 until 2004. And that brought in some new legislation. It was called the Renewables Obligation. It came in 2002. And what that did, it was a very powerful piece of legislation, and it compelled it was mostly electricity companies, that a certain percentage of their output had to be renewable. And it acted as a ratchet, and the percentage went up every year. And if they met their target, they got financial rewards. If they failed to meet their target, they got a financial penalty. And the very unusual thing, was that the penalties did not go to the Treasury. The penalties went to the competitors who had met their targets. And so, of course, the industry hated this, paying their competitors large sums of money. And so when I look back, I think that piece of legislation was very successful. It almost, if anything, it was too successful, because another 4 or 5 years down the track, there was so much renewable capacity being generated, and this, of course, was paid through electricity bills, that the cost of the consumer was getting out of control. And so the government, and this was after my time, but the government had to change tack, not change direction, but change tack. And it introduced a scheme called Contracts for Differences. And that was basically an auction scheme. So instead of guaranteeing people, if you produce this much electricity, you will get this much subsidy, they said, well, you can bring forward plans, but we are only going to reward the most economical projects. And this had some interesting effects, because, of course, a project that is in Kent, very close to the London market, is going to be much more economical than a project in the north of Scotland, which is a long way from demand centres and a lot of associated grid costs. So there's a lot of debate came out of the Contract for Differences, but we still have the Contract for Differences now. It still exists, and people take the risk of development projects. It's very expensive to develop a large renewable project, and they're hoping of being able to be awarded a Contract for Difference award by the UK government. But it is a change from the guaranteed system that operated in the early 2000s. The other change I've noticed, and it's from my time in Aberdeen. After I left UK government, I went to Aberdeen, and we built an offshore wind farm there, much to Donald Trump's annoyance. But we also brought in hydrogen buses, and we got 10 hydrogen buses into Aberdeen. There are now 20, and another 10 double-deckers on the way, world first double-decker hydrogen bus. And I think this is back to your point about transport. I think renewable forms of transport, not just electric vehicles, but hydrogen vehicles as well, is a very exciting area at the moment. We've got talk of hydrogen trains here in Scotland. We've got a scheme here in Fife where they're going to convert 100 homes from natural gas over to hydrogen. And this is all coming. Everyone's cooker will be adjusted to go back to hydrogen, having been on North Sea gas for 30 or 40 years. And it's extremely exciting time for energy transition. Jose.
I have a question
How
about.
do you view the? Sorry.
Yes. I have a question about this network market hierarchy dimensions, and whether the notion of geographical coordination or kind of geography planning and the location of power plants or projects in general has become more prominent to citizens as stakeholders. Sort of whether the idea that these locations decisions have to be made even more centralized, or whether they have to be more localized. I think there's interesting changes about expectations on those grounds, but I would like to know if you have found anything interesting on that area as well.
Yeah, I think energy production has become more distributed over time. It used to be much more centralized, and there was a lot of thought as to where these big, huge power stations would go, especially nuclear power stations as well. Now, of course, in Scotland, we're not going to have any more nuclear power stations, but in England, Hinkley Point C is well under construction now. It will be producing electricity by 2026. So there are still some very large power stations, but what we will see much more, I think, are small-scale distributed power generation, and even to the extent of individual communities becoming more independent of the grid. Do you see that in Mexico? Do you see this trend also, or is it still?
Yeah, I was thinking of a lot of much more government decisions regarding the geography of power plants, even when it's more decentralized. Even in the UK, where kind of the government decides that through different policy and regulatory tools, there's essentially not going to be onshore wind farms in England and Wales. And then you have the kind of crown estates making a lot of planning decisions for how to use the offshore platform and where to seat these offshore power plants. So, I think Mexico has been moving in a more decentralized type of planning, and China it's incredibly decentralized because everyone does whatever they want depending on the province they are. But it seems to me exactly that the UK, there's not much of a centralized planning because there's not that large central power stations anymore, or only a few cases. But even despite that kind of fragmentation of the size of power plants, that creates another form of centralization in the way that the location of all of these type of projects are located. Yeah. So it's kind of a different way of centralizing, I guess, but it's interesting.
Yeah, you raise a very good point, because here in Scotland, we have a lot of open space and a lot of onshore wind farms are developed. Then it goes to the local planning committee, and any wind farm, there will be people who object to the visual impact. And often the councillors on the planning committee, they will say, no, we don't want this wind farm because it's, they want to respect the views of their citizens. But what happens next is it goes on appeal to Scottish Government in Edinburgh. And there are many wind farm cases, dozens, where the local authority has said no, and it goes to the Scottish Government and they've said yes, and the wind farm goes ahead. So it's precisely the point you make. It's a more centralized decision making because of this appeal of the planning system. And Scotland, the land area is probably getting quite saturated now with wind farms, and that is why, as you say, they're opening up much more areas of sea. Crown Estate is opening up the sea for more offshore wind farms. Yes, Sarah.
Paula and Jake and I are working on community energy at the moment, and we're finding that communities tend to rely very heavily on the local network operator, on the supplier. In some European countries, of course, in most European countries, those are the same thing, in order to function. So when you talk about communities managing their own energy, I think perhaps Scotland has some quite good examples of this, some of the best perhaps, but we're finding it's extremely difficult for them to be able to do that. And you sound quite optimistic about it though. So I wanted to ask you.
I sound optimistic.
Where your grounds for optimism are.
I sound optimistic because I am an optimist, but I would always say to anybody who was thinking of developing a wind farm, it's going to cost a lot more than you think, and it's going to take many years longer than you think. The Aberdeen offshore wind farm, when we started it, we thought it would maybe take 2 or 3 years, and it took 10 years to get government consent. It took another 5 years to deal with Donald Trump's legal challenges. So it was built in one summer, but it took 15 years. Now, of course, the great benefit was in those 15 years, we started with turbines that were 2 megawatts. By the time it was built, the largest wind turbines were 8 megawatts. So we had quite a lot of economy of scale coming in on the cost. But it can take a very, very long time, as you well know.
But the difficulties can be about governance as well, and particularly as you get smart technology coming in, and the management gets more complex. So we're talking about local management of electricity, particularly. So not just having the generation, though that's often a part of it, but the actual governance and having the kind of regulatory background that favors that local governance.
I am
community energy.
Optimistically awaiting a letter from our electricity provider to ask if they can control my electric car as a storage device when it sits on my drive, and store electricity there and take it away from it. And I'm sure that will also come in time. It hasn't happened yet, but it can't be too far away, I hope. Does anyone have a question, please? Please don't take a question home with you. Or comment. Yeah, Jake.
So yeah, coming back to your interesting presentation, there was quite a striking difference between the barriers raised in South Africa and then in Europe with the Netherlands and the UK. Do you think that was a result of the different countries and the different contexts, or because of the difference in time and the impacts of COVID? Could you try and unpack that situation, yeah, and try and ascribe things to COVID or to the different situation?
Yeah, I don't think it was particularly COVID. I think that the South African image, it would be typical of a country that is highly reliant on coal. And so you would expect to find something quite similar in Australia, Indonesia, the large coal using countries of the world. Possibly Mexico, Jose, and I don't know how much coal there is in Mexico. And I would also expect most European Union countries to look quite similar to the UK and Netherlands. There's not huge differences in energy. I mean, Europe is well on track to remove coal altogether. Even in Spain, Spain is a major user of coal, but they've set a target by 2030. They're going to finish with coal generation. I think the other country in Europe that is most coal dependent is Poland. And I think they are acting quite slowly in the hope that the European Union will give them more funds to fund their energy transition, I suspect.
So most of the differences ascribed to the different country contexts.
Yes, I would say.
Yeah, and from what you're saying, you didn't see much difference between the UK and the Netherlands.
No, we didn't expect to see huge differences actually, but we didn't find that. They're really quite similar.
Yeah.
And some of the companies we interviewed had offices in both UK and Netherlands. You know, they view it as a common marketplace. The national boundaries aren't a major issue for them.
So did you gain any insights about what the impact of COVID might have been on the barriers then? Because it felt like that was the premise of that bit of research last summer. How has COVID impacted the role?
I think the points that flowed from that were the uncertainty about whether governments would be able to finance energy transition. So there was a kind of bit of an emphasis on the government and a bit of an emphasis on the finance because of that. But even in the 9 months since then, the situation has changed, and I would expect if we repeated the interviews now, it would be different again. It was right at the peak of the uncertainty almost that we were doing these interviews. And I think once things get partially back to where they were before, I would expect to see those barriers changing a little bit as well.
I just have a thought about take-or-pay contracts that are very frequent in Africa. So those take-or-pay contracts are with independent power producers for 30 years or 55 years. So how can those countries succeed in energy transition with those take-or-pay contracts that represent a big portion of the energy production of a country?
Yeah. I think that's a good question, because that is one of the tactics of the fossil fuel industry, is to lock in their technology contractually and legally into the national infrastructure. And I think that's why change is going to be very slow. But the government has to dismantle that, and it would probably require compensation to some of the parties for giving up their contractual rights. They'll say, well, we're going to restrict this for 10 years now instead of 50 years. And you would have to pay a compensation of some kind to the people who'd lost out. I mean, that comes back to the whole thing about a just transition. You know, how do you help the workers in the fossil fuel industries to move to the new normal? You know, reskilling was one of the things that came out of our recommendations, but it's not as simple as that, because maybe the new jobs are not in the same part of the country as the old jobs, etc. And Ted.
I'll just chime in on that as well, and I'll put my lawyer's hat on now. I think this is where, when you did the governance structure, where top-down, network, and market, I think when law is treated as an afterthought, it still shapes the energy mix. And if you look at a lot of international instruments, they say that they will not influence what the energy mix of a country looks like. But I think law, policy, and regulation need to be far more deliberate in determining what the energy mix should look like to determine the energy transition. And at the moment, it's not internationally in vogue to do that, but I think not doing that results in the sort of perverse incentive or locking in, as Nazreen has said, of long-term, especially contractual arrangements, or absence of legal commitment means that more powerful actors in the market have a disproportionate control over energy systems. And this is where now, I advocate for that perhaps governments, as you said, are powerful things. And as Sarah said, they actually shape human behavior, but more importantly, they shape the entire energy system. And I think law needs to be central in determining the energy mix and energy system.
It'll be interesting to see what comes out of COP, whether there is some quasi-legal requirement for carbon pricing, perhaps. I mean, that's one of the areas people mention in COP, that this would be a global agreement on a carbon price. But Ted, are you thinking legislation or proposals for legislation might come out of COP? Is that part of your thinking?
I'm thinking two things. Initially, I know of a few groups who are thinking of a new international treaty, some sort of international instrument. I think it's with less than 6 months. It's going to be very, very difficult to build consensus for that. The other thought is to use the UK as an exemplar and the Climate Change Act and tie that to some sort of financing obligation where they say, look, if you adopt some sort of model law, especially for developing countries, then you'll have access to financing, which will then shape the transition. So like some sort of global net zero targets with commitments. There's the third group that are thinking of something similar, which is establishing a fund and having a tiered system where the people who want, or the countries that want to have, or the actors as well, which should include private sector, who want to have the highest level of commitment are, say, tier 1, and they pursue those. Those tier 2 would be those who have the willingness, but they lack the capacity. And this fund will allow them to transition to tier 1. And then there'll be a shaming mechanism for the ones who refuse to follow the more ambitious commitments. However, the danger in that is China, South Africa, the US, we're not so sure. The US has been quite a surprise this year. They've supported things that they traditionally don't. Or India, if those countries become tier 3, then there's a question of how much global traction can this be had. So, and then there's a group that distinctly wants a bottom-up approach, where they say communities, law shouldn't be a top-down, and there should be a focus on communities and cities and so on. So the sense that I get, no one's really clear, but everyone's trying to push for some form of commitment that's binding and not negotiations and just some sort of plans. Because clearly people make all these NDCs, nationally determined contributions, many of them are not being met, and there is no consequence to not meeting whatever people claim they will commit to. So those are the noises I'm hearing about potential for.
Okay. I hope to see you at COP26 later in the year, Ted. That would be good. That would be lovely. Well, thank you all very much for your questions and comments. I've enjoyed it greatly. And good luck with your next phase of your Integrate project.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian.
No, it's been a pleasure. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, and great to see you again, Ted. Yeah, and thanks for setting it up, Paula. It's been great. Okay, I'll stick down.
Right.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.